Okay, let me ask you something. Were you allowed to touch the thermostat in your house growing up? Because in mine, oh, absolutely not. It was practically a federal law. Touching the thermostat was Dad's territory, and stepping out of line meant swift justice. In fact, I'm pretty sure my dad thought he was running a small HVAC dictatorship. It didn't matter if you were sweating through a summer heat wave or shivering under 3 blankets in February unless Dad decreed it. That thermostat stayed exactly where it was. And looking back now, I realize just how ridiculous this rule really was. Let me take you back to the old days and explain how the thermostat became the most sacred, untouchable thing in our entire house. Setting the scene, life in the 90s suburbs. Our house sat at the end of Juniper Lane, in one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every driveway had a basketball hoop and every garage was overflowing with bikes and lawnmowers. We had a light blue Buick LeSabre parked in ours, and my dad, Mike, was always tinkering with it on weekends, muttering about getting another 10,000 miles out of her. The thermostat, though, that was his true masterpiece. It was one of those old Honeywell dial models, the kind you had to twist with just the right amount of force to find the sweet spot. It hung on the wall in our living room, right next to a framed picture of my grandparents and a ceramic plaque that said, "Bless this house." Dad treated that thermostat like it was the Ark of the Covenant. And while most dads have their quirks, mine had a full-blown ritual. Every morning before work, he'd stand in front of it, hands on his hips, staring at the dial like a general planning his next move. Then he'd mutter something like, 68 is good, maybe 69 if it drops tonight, before turning the dial with the precision of a safecracker. And God help you if you touched it after that. The rule is declared, don't you dare touch the thermostat. I'll never forget the day the rule became official. It was the middle of July and the house felt like a sauna. My mom, my brother Danny, and I were practically melting, sprawled out on the living room floor like a bunch of overheated dogs. Why don't we just turn on the air conditioning? I asked, wiping sweat off my forehead. Don't even think about it, Mom said. Why not? I asked. Because your father said so. And then, as if summoned by the sound of rebellion, Dad appeared in the doorway, holding a wrench like he'd just stepped out of a hardware commercial. What's this about the AC? He asked, narrowing his eyes. It's 90 degrees in here, Mike, Mom said. And that's why God invented fans, Dad replied, pointing to the oscillating fan in the corner that was doing absolutely nothing to cool us down. Then he turned to me and Danny. Listen up. The thermostat isn't a toy. You don't touch it unless you're paying the electric bill. From that moment on, the thermostat was declared a no-touch zone, and Dad became its sole gatekeeper. Daily life with the thermostat tyrant. Living under Dad's thermostat rule was like being stuck in a weather experiment. In the summer, he'd insist that 78 degrees is perfectly comfortable, while we all sweated through our clothes. In the winter, he'd crank it down to 65, saying, "You've got sweaters, don't you?" One Christmas Eve, it got so cold that we could see our breath in the living room. My sister Sarah begged Dad to turn up the heat, but he just handed her a blanket and said, "You're not going to freeze. People in Minnesota live like this all the time." But the real kicker was his obsession with energy efficiency. He'd give us these long lectures about how every degree on the thermostat was costing him hard-earned dollars. And every time he got the electric bill in the mail, he'd hold it up like it was evidence in a courtroom and say, "See? This is why we don't touch the thermostat." One time, I made the mistake of sneaking a twist of the dial while Dad was in the garage. I'd barely turned it up to 70 before he stormed into the house, yelling, "Who touched the thermostat?" I tried to blame Danny, but Dad wasn't buying it. He stood there, finger wagging, and said, "The thermostat doesn't lie." To this day, I have no idea how he knew. Maybe he had a sixth sense. Maybe he checked the meter. All I know is I never dared touch it again. The thermostat rebellion, by the time I hit high school, I'd had enough. One particularly freezing January night, while Dad was out bowling with his buddies, I decided to stage a rebellion. "Let's crank it to 75, I said to Danny and Sarah, who both gasped like I'd suggested robbing a bank. "Are you crazy?" Danny asked. He'll never know, I said, turning the dial with a grin. The house instantly felt warmer, cozy, or almost luxurious. For the first time in years, we weren't bundled up like Arctic explorers. But then, around midnight, the front door creaked open, and I heard Dad's boots on the tile floor. I raced to the thermostat, trying to turn it back before he noticed, but it was too late. He walked into the living room, took one look at the dial, and said, 75? What is this? The Bahamas? The next day, he installed a lockbox over the thermostat. A literal lockbox. He even gave us a speech about how it was for our own good, which we all knew was just dad speak for I don't trust you. The truth comes out why the rule existed. Years later, after I'd moved out, I asked Dad why he was so obsessed with the thermostat. You kids don't remember the energy crisis in the 70s, he said, shaking his head like he was talking about a war. We had to learn to conserve. You didn't just crank the heat up willy-nilly. You may do. So this whole time, it was about saving money? I asked. He shrugged and said, partly. But mostly, it was just fun messing with you. Classic dad. Conclusion, so there you have it, the ridiculous rule that defined my childhood. To this day, I still hesitate before adjusting the thermostat in my own house, half expecting my dad to burst through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man. What about you? Did your parents have any rules that made no sense? Drop your stories in the comments, I'd love to hear them. And hey, if you like this trip down memory lane, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Until next time, stay warm or not, depending on what Dad says.